The small courtroom buzzed with the low hum of murmured conversations. People shifted uncomfortably on the hard wooden benches, some glancing at their watches while others stared blankly ahead. Sunlight streamed through tall windows, casting long shadows across the worn floorboards. The air smelled faintly of polished wood and old papers, a scent that seemed to echo the weight of authority in the room. At the front sat Judge Harold Dawson, a man in his late 50s with thinning gray hair and a perpetually stern expression. His gavel lay ready on the desk before him, a silent reminder of his power. Today's docket was filled with minor cases, traffic, violations, noise complaints, and one or two disputes between neighbors. Nothing particularly exciting. But then came case number 47, Karoline Leavitt versus the town of Maplewood. As the bailiff called her name, a young woman rose from the back row. She walked slowly to the podium, her steps measured but not hesitant. Her dark hair framed a face that appeared calm, almost serene despite the circumstances. Around her neck hung a simple silver cross, its presence unassuming yet deliberate. Karoline stood quietly as the charges were read aloud. According to the town's recently enacted ordinance, wearing any visible religious symbol in public spaces constituted a violation of local law. It was an obscure rule, rarely enforced until now. When asked if she understood the accusation, Karoline nodded. "Yes," she said softly, her voice steady. "I understand." Judge Dawson frowned. He had seen defendants like her before, young, idealistic, unwilling to bend to authority. They often thought they could outsmart the system only to leave defeated and humiliated. This would be no different, he assured himself. "Miss Leavitt," he began, leaning forward slightly, "you are aware that you have been cited for violating Ordinance 32B? "I am," Karoline replied without hesitation. Her tone carried neither defiance nor apology, just a quiet confidence that made the judge pause. "And yet," Judge Dawson continued, gesturing toward the delicate cross resting against her collarbone, "you refuse to comply by removing the item in question?" Karoline glanced down at the pendant briefly before meeting the judge's gaze again. "Your Honor, I believe this ordinance infringes upon my constitutional rights, specifically, my right to freely exercise my religion." A murmur rippled through the gallery. Such arguments weren't uncommon, but they usually came from seasoned attorneys, not ordinary citizens. Judge Dawson raised a hand to silence the crowd. "Miss Leavitt," he said firmly, "this court does not concern itself with debates over constitutional validity during arraignment proceedings. You will either remove the offending object or accept the consequences of your non-compliance." For a moment, there was silence. Karoline didn't move. Instead, she tilted her head slightly, studying the judge as though weighing his words carefully. Then, in a voice clear enough to carry throughout the room, she spoke. "With all due respect, Your Honor, I must point out that the language of Ordinance 32B is vague and overly broad. For instance, it fails to define what constitutes a religious symbol. By this standard, could someone wearing a Star of David bracelet also be fined? Or perhaps a hijab? What about a kippah?" Her questions hung in the air, sharp and unyielding. Several spectators exchanged uneasy glances. Even Judge Dawson seemed taken aback, though he quickly masked his surprise with irritation. "Miss Leavitt," he snapped, "this is not a debate forum. If you persist in challenging the court's authority, I will hold you in contempt." But Karoline wasn't finished. "If I may, Your Honor," she pressed on, undeterred. "The First Amendment protects not only the freedom to worship, but also the right to express one's beliefs openly. By penalizing individuals for displaying symbols tied to their faith, this ordinance effectively suppresses protected speech. Furthermore, it violates the Establishment Clause by favoring secular expressions over religious ones." Now the murmurs grew louder, more animated. A few people nodded approvingly while others whispered nervously to their neighbors. Judge Dawson gripped the edge of his bench, his knuckles whitening. He hadn't expected this, not from someone who looked so unassuming. Yet here she was, dismantling the ordinance piece by piece, citing legal precedents with ease. "Enough," the judge barked, slamming his gavel down hard enough to make everyone jump. You've made your point, Miss Leavitt. However, this court operates under the presumption that laws passed by duly elected officials are valid, unless proven otherwise. Since you refuse to comply with the ordinance, I hereby fine you $200 for contempt of court. Do you have anything further to say? Karoline shook her head. No, Your Honor, thank you for allowing me to speak. There was no bitterness in her tone, only a quiet resolve that left the judge feeling oddly unsettled. As she returned to her seat, the courtroom erupted into hushed discussions. Some admired her bravery, others dismissed her as naive. But one thing was certain. Karoline Leavitt had managed to turn what should have been a routine hearing into something far more intriguing. Later that afternoon, after the day's cases had concluded, Judge Dawson sat alone in his chambers, staring at the stack of files on his desk. Normally, he would have already moved on to the next matter, but today was different. Try as he might, he couldn't shake the image of Karoline standing at the podium, calmly dissecting the ordinance with precision and clarity. Who was she? How did she know so much about the law? And why hadn't she hired a lawyer to represent her? Curiosity got the better of him. Picking up the phone, he dialed the number for his clerk, Margaret Klein. Margaret, he said when she answered, do me a favor. Look into that woman from this morning, Karoline Leavitt. Find out everything you can about her. Margaret hesitated. Everything, Your Honor? Like background checks and employment records? Yes, Judge Dawson replied curtly. Whatever you need to do, just get it done. After hanging up, he leaned back in his chair, rubbing his temples. Something about Karoline nagged at him, though he couldn't quite put his finger on it. Perhaps it was the way she had handled herself in court, with such poise and intelligence. Or maybe it was the realization that, for the first time in years, someone had genuinely challenged him. Whatever it was, he knew one thing for sure. This wasn't the last he'd hear of Karoline Leavitt. Meanwhile, Karoline stepped out of the courthouse and into the crisp autumn air. She adjusted the strap of her bag on her shoulder and took a deep breath, letting the cool breeze wash over her. Despite the fine, she felt a strange sense of satisfaction. Sure, she hadn't won the case, but she had planted a seed, a spark of doubt in the minds of those who believed they could trample on individual freedoms without consequence. As she walked toward the bus stop, a man approached her. He was middle-aged, with glasses perched on his nose and a notebook tucked under his arm. Excuse me, he said, smiling warmly. Are you Karoline Leavitt? She nodded cautiously. Yes, can I help you? My name is Daniel Hayes, he introduced himself, extending a hand. I'm a journalist with the Maplewood Gazette. I was in the courtroom earlier, and I have to say I'm impressed. Very few people would stand up the way you did. Karoline accepted his handshake but remained guarded. Thank you, she said politely. But I'm not looking for attention. Daniel chuckled. Don't worry, I'm not here to cause trouble. I just wanted to ask if you'd be open to talking more about your experience. Off the record, of course. She considered his request for a moment. Though wary of journalists, there was something sincere about Daniel's demeanor. Finally, she nodded. All right, she agreed. But let's keep it brief. They found a nearby bench and sat down. Over the next 20 minutes, Daniel listened intently as Karoline explained her reasons for fighting the ordinance. She spoke passionately about the importance of protecting civil liberties and ensuring that everyone, regardless of their beliefs, had the right to live freely. By the time they parted ways, Daniel knew he had stumbled onto something extraordinary. Back home that evening, Karoline settled into her cozy apartment, surrounded by shelves lined with books. She poured herself a cup of tea and opened a thick volume on constitutional law. As she flipped through the pages, her thoughts drifted back to the events of the day. She hadn't planned on becoming a crusader for justice, but sometimes life had a way of steering you down unexpected paths. Little did she know, this was only the beginning. The next morning, Judge Harold Dawson arrived at his chambers earlier than usual. He had spent most of the previous night thinking about Karoline Leavitt and her unexpected display of legal knowledge. It wasn't just her arguments that lingered in his mind. It was the calm confidence with which she delivered them. She didn't seem like someone who had stumbled into a courtroom by accident. There was something deliberate, almost calculated, about the way she spoke. And yet, according to the records Margaret Klein had pulled together, Karoline wasn't even a lawyer. Margaret had left a folder on his desk before heading out to handle other tasks. Inside were copies of Karoline's employment history, education, records, and a few notes from interviews with coworkers. The information painted a picture of an ordinary young woman. She worked as a librarian at the Maplewood Public Library, lived alone in a modest apartment, and had no formal training in law beyond a single introductory course she'd taken during her college years. Yet somehow, she possessed an understanding of constitutional principles that rivaled seasoned attorneys. Dawson flipped through the pages, his brow furrowed. How could someone with such limited exposure to the legal system argue so effectively? Was it natural talent, or had she been preparing for this moment without anyone knowing? He tapped his pen against the desk, lost in thought. For a man who prided himself on fairness and adherence to the rules, Karoline's presence in his courtroom felt like a challenge, one he couldn't ignore. Meanwhile, Karoline began her day, as she always did, with a quiet routine. After brewing a pot of coffee, she sat by the window with a book, letting the sunlight warm her face. Despite the fine she had incurred, she felt oddly energized. The encounter with Judge Dawson had awakened something inside her, a desire to push back against injustices, no matter how small they seemed. She had always believed in standing up for what was right, but now she realized she might actually have the tools to make a difference. Later that afternoon, Karoline headed to work at the library. Nestled in the heart of downtown Maplewood, the Eish building was a cozy haven filled with the scent of old books and polished wood. She greeted her coworker, Lucy Bennett, with a smile as she clocked in. "Busy day ahead?" Lucy asked, adjusting the stack of returned books in her arms. "Not too bad," Karoline replied, tying her apron around her waist. "Just the usual." Lucy raised an eyebrow. "You sure? You've been getting a lot of attention lately. I heard about your court appearance. Pretty bold move wearing that cross." Karoline shrugged. It wasn't about being bold. It was about principle. If we let them chip away at our freedoms bit by bit, where does it end? Lucy nodded thoughtfully. "Well, whatever your reasons, people are talking. Some say you're inspiring, others think you're asking for trouble." She paused, then added with a grin, "Personally, I think it's kind of cool." Karoline laughed softly. "Thanks, Lucy. I'll take that as a compliment." As the day wore on, Karoline found herself distracted. Between shelving books and helping patrons, her mind kept drifting back to the courtroom. She wondered if Judge Dawson would reconsider his stance after hearing her arguments. More importantly, she wondered if anyone else would step forward to challenge the ordinance. Surely she couldn't be the only one affected by it. Her thoughts were interrupted when a familiar voice called out, "Karoline?" Turning, she saw Daniel Hayes approaching. He held a notebook in one hand and a cup of coffee in the other. "Do you have a minute?" he asked. "Of course," she said, leading him to a quiet corner near the reference section. "What's up?" Daniel hesitated, choosing his words carefully. "I've been doing some digging since we talked yesterday. That ordinance you were fined for violating, it's part of something bigger." Karoline frowned. "Bigger how?" He leaned closer, lowering his voice. "There's a pattern here. Over the past year, similar laws have popped up in towns across the state. They all target religious symbols, free speech, or both. At first glance, they look harmless, just local regulations. But when you connect the dots, it starts to look like a coordinated effort to suppress dissent." Karoline's eyes widened. "Who's behind it?" "That's the tricky part," Daniel admitted. "No one's claiming responsibility, but there are rumors about a group of wealthy donors funding these initiatives. Their goal seems to be undermining civil liberties, under the guise of maintaining order." For a moment, Karoline was silent. The idea that her case might be tied to a larger conspiracy was overwhelming. "Why tell me this?" she asked finally. "Because you're already involved," Daniel said simply. "Whether you like it or not, You've become a symbol of resistance. People are watching what happens next. If you walk away now, it sends a message that they can keep pushing these laws without consequences." Karoline sighed, running a hand through her hair. "I never asked for this. I'm just trying to live my life." "I know," Daniel said gently. "But sometimes life asks things of us anyway. Look, I'm not saying you need to take on the world single-handedly, but if you're willing to fight, I can help. Together we might be able to expose what's really going on." She considered his offer, weighing the risks against the potential rewards. On one hand, pursuing this path could put her in danger. On the other, it offered a chance to protect not only herself but others who lacked the means to stand up. "All right," she said at last. "Let's do it." Over the next few days, Karoline and Daniel worked tirelessly to gather evidence. They pored over documents, interviewed residents who had faced similar fines, and traced the money trail linking the ordinances to shadowy organizations. Karoline spent her evenings drafting letters to local officials, outlining the constitutional flaws in the laws. Her writing was sharp and persuasive, drawing on both logic and emotion to make her case. One evening, as they reviewed their findings in Karoline's apartment, Daniel looked up from his notes. "You're amazing, you know that?" he said with a grin. "Most people would crumble under this kind of pressure, but you just keep going." Karoline smiled faintly. "I don't feel amazing, I feel scared. What if we're wrong? Or worse, what if we're right and nothing changes?" "We won't know unless we try," Daniel replied. "Besides, you've already proven you can hold your own against judges and lawmakers. Imagine what you could do with more resources." His words gave her a glimmer of hope, but uncertainty still lingered. The road ahead promised to be long and difficult, fraught with obstacles she couldn't yet foresee. Still, she reminded herself why she had started down this path in the first place, to defend the values she held dear. Unbeknownst to Karoline, her actions were beginning to attract attention beyond Maplewood. News outlets picked up the story, framing her as a modern-day David taking on Goliath. Social media buzzed with hashtags like "Quarng Stand with Karoline" and "Warn Free to Believe." Strangers reached out to offer support, sharing their own experiences of fighting unjust laws. Even Judge Dawson found himself inundated with calls and emails from concerned citizens, urging him to revisit the case. At first, he dismissed the messages as irrelevant noise, but as the pressure mounted, he began to see the broader implications of Karoline's challenge. If she succeeded in overturning the ordinance, it could set a precedent that reverberated far beyond their small town. And if she failed, it might embolden others to enact even stricter regulations. Late one night, unable to sleep, Dawson wandered into his study. He pulled a dusty law book from the shelf and flipped through its pages, searching for answers. As he read, he realized something unsettling. Karoline was right. The ordinance was flawed, legally and ethically. Enforcing it meant sacrificing fundamental freedoms for the sake of questionable gains. Yet admitting as much would require swallowing his pride and possibly jeopardizing his career. By the time dawn broke, Dawson had made up his mind. Whether he liked it or not, Karoline Leavitt had forced him to confront uncomfortable truths. And while he wasn't ready to side with her publicly, he resolved to keep an open mind moving forward. Back at the library, Karoline continued her daily routines, outwardly unchanged but inwardly transformed. She knew the battle was far from over, but for the first time in her life, she felt truly alive. Whatever challenges lay ahead, she was determined to face them head-on, with courage, conviction, and an unwavering belief in the power of justice. The weeks leading up to the federal court hearing were a blur of preparation and tension for Karoline. She spent every spare moment reviewing case law, rehearsing arguments, and refining her delivery under Emily Grant's watchful eye. The retired attorney had transformed their makeshift workspace, a corner of Karoline's living room, into something resembling a legal war room. Notes, charts, and highlighted documents covered every available surface, while stacks of books on constitutional law teetered precariously on the coffee table. "You're ready," Emily said one evening after yet another practice session. Her tone was firm but encouraging. You've studied harder than most lawyers I know. Just remember, stay calm, stick to your points, and don't let them rattle you. Karoline nodded, though deep down she wasn't sure she believed it. The thought of facing a panel of federal judges terrified her. These weren't local officials or small-town magistrates. They were some of the sharpest legal minds in the country. What if she froze? What if she stumbled over her words or failed to answer their questions convincingly? Daniel noticed her unease and tried to reassure her. "You've got this," he said, handing her a cup of tea. "Think about all the times you stood up for what's right without anyone telling you to. That's who you are. You're not just fighting for yourself, you're fighting for everyone who can't." His words helped ease her nerves, but only slightly. As the date of the hearing approached, Karoline found herself replaying every possible scenario in her mind. She imagined hostile judges, aggressive opposing counsel, and worst of all, losing the case entirely. But even in her darkest moments, she reminded herself why she was doing this. It wasn't about personal victory. It was about protecting freedoms that people often took for granted until they were gone. On the morning of the hearing, Karoline dressed carefully, choosing a simple navy blue suit that made her feel professional and composed. She met Daniel and Emily outside the courthouse where reporters and curious onlookers had gathered. Cameras flashed as they walked toward the entrance, and Karoline kept her head high, focusing on the task ahead. Inside, the courtroom buzzed with anticipation. Lawyers bustled about, exchanging last-minute notes, while court staff prepared the benches and podiums. When the judges entered, the room fell silent. Karoline watched as three figures in black robes took their seats at the elevated bench. Their expressions were unreadable, giving no hint of how they might rule. After brief introductions, the proceedings began. Opposing counsel, representing Maplewood and its controversial ordinance, spoke first. He argued that the law was necessary to maintain public order and prevent divisiveness caused by visible displays of religion. Karoline listened intently, jotting down notes as he spoke. When it was her turn, she rose from her seat and approached the podium. Her heart pounded in her chest, but she forced herself to breathe deeply and focus. Looking up at the judges, she began. "Your Honors," she said, her voice steady, despite her nerves. "This case is not about maintaining order. It's about restricting freedom. The ordinance in question infringes upon fundamental rights guaranteed by the First Amendment, the right to free exercise of religion, and the right to express one's beliefs openly. By penalizing individuals for wearing symbols tied to their faith, the town of Maplewood has effectively created a hierarchy of expression, one that favors secularism over spirituality." She paused, glancing at the judges to gauge their reactions. They remained impassive, so she continued. "Furthermore, this law is overly broad and vague. It fails to define what constitutes a religious symbol, leaving enforcement arbitrary and inconsistent. Could someone wearing a Star of David necklace be fined, or a hijab? Where do we draw the line?" One of the judges leaned forward slightly. "Miss Leavitt," he said, his tone measured, "aren't there limits to free expression when it comes to maintaining societal harmony? Isn't it reasonable for a community to set guidelines to avoid conflicts?" Karoline nodded. "Absolutely, Your Honor. However, those guidelines must be narrowly tailored to serve a compelling government interest without burdening constitutional rights. This ordinance does neither. It targets specific forms of expression based solely on their religious nature, which violates the Establishment Clause. Instead of fostering unity, it creates division by singling out certain groups for punishment." The judges exchanged glances, seemingly intrigued by her argument. Another judge chimed in. "What precedent supports your claim that this law is unconstitutional?" Karoline smiled faintly. This was the part she had prepared for. "Several cases come to mind, Your Honor. In Tinker v. Des Moines Independent Community School District, the Supreme Court ruled that symbolic speech is protected unless it disrupts the functioning of an institution. Wearing a cross or any other religious symbol does not cause disruption. It simply expresses belief." Similarly, in Employment Division v. Smith, the court clarified that laws targeting religious practices must pass strict scrutiny to be upheld. This ordinance fails. that test because it is neither narrowly tailored nor serves a compelling interest. As she spoke, Karoline felt a surge of confidence. The hours of study and practice were paying off. She could see the judges nodding thoughtfully, their pens moving across their notepads. When opposing counsel attempted to counter her points, she responded calmly and decisively, dismantling his arguments piece by piece. By the time she returned to her seat, Daniel gave her a discreet thumbs up. Emily, seated beside her, whispered, "Well done." Though the outcome was still uncertain, Karoline knew she had given it her all. Outside the courtroom, the atmosphere was electric. Reporters crowded around, eager for comments. Karoline declined to speak, letting Daniel handle the media. "We believe today's arguments clearly demonstrate the unconstitutionality of this ordinance," he told the cameras. "Karoline has shown incredible courage, standing up for her rights, and for the rights of others." Back at home that evening, Karoline collapsed onto her couch, exhausted but exhilarated. For the first time in weeks, she allowed herself to relax. Emily joined her, sipping a glass of wine. "You impressed them," the older woman said. "I saw it in their faces. They were listening." "I hope so," Karoline replied softly. "But even if we lose, at least we tried." Emily shook her head. "This isn't over yet. No matter what happens, you've already sparked change. People are talking about these issues now. That's a victory in itself." Across town, Judge Harold Dawson sat alone in his study, reflecting on the day's events. He had followed the hearing closely, tuning into live broadcasts and reading transcripts afterward. To his surprise and dismay, he found himself agreeing with many of Karoline's arguments. The more he thought about it, the more he realized how flawed the ordinance truly was. Margaret Klein called him later that night. "How's it going, Your Honor?" she asked cautiously. "It's complicated," Dawson admitted. "I've been thinking, maybe I should issue a statement, acknowledge the concerns raised by Miss Leavitt and others." Margaret hesitated. "Are you sure? That could open a whole new can of worms." "Maybe," Dawson said. "But sometimes, doing the right thing means taking risks." Meanwhile, the Liberty Council grew increasingly desperate. Behind closed doors, its leaders debated strategies to salvage the situation. Some suggested filing amicus briefs in support of the ordinance, while others pushed for smear campaigns against Karoline. They underestimated her resilience, however, and underestimated the growing public sympathy for her cause. Days turned into weeks as the judges deliberated. During this time, Karoline returned to her routine, working at the library and spending quiet evenings at home. She tried not to dwell on the outcome, focusing instead on the lessons she had learned throughout the process. Whether she won or lost, she knew she had grown stronger and wiser. Finally, the decision came. On a crisp autumn morning, the federal court issued its ruling. The ordinance was unconstitutional. The judges cited violations of the First Amendment and criticized its vague language and discriminatory intent. The verdict sent shockwaves through Maplewood and beyond, sparking celebrations among supporters of civil liberties. Karoline read the news with tears in her eyes. She hadn't expected to win, not completely, but here it was, written in black and white. Justice had prevailed. That afternoon, she received a call from Judge Dawson. His voice was hesitant but sincere. "Miss Leavitt," he began, "I owe you an apology. I misjudged you and the situation from the start. You've shown remarkable integrity and intelligence. If you're ever interested in pursuing a career in law, I'd be honored to write you a recommendation." Karoline was stunned. "Thank you, Your Honor," she managed to say. "That means a lot." As she hung up, she couldn't help but smile. The journey had been long and difficult, but it had also been transformative. She had faced fear, doubt, and opposition, and emerged stronger than ever. Whatever challenges lay ahead, she knew she was ready to meet them. The days turned into weeks, and Karoline's life became a whirlwind of activity. Between her shifts at the library, late-night research sessions, and meetings with Daniel, she barely had time to catch her breath. Yet, despite the exhaustion, She felt a sense of purpose she had never known before. Every new piece of evidence they uncovered brought them closer to exposing the conspiracy behind the ordinance. It was like solving a puzzle, except the stakes were far higher than any game. 1. Evening, as Karoline sat at her kitchen table surrounded by stacks of papers, Daniel burst through the door with an excited grin. "You're not going to believe this," he said, holding up a folder. "I think I found something big." Karoline set down her pen and leaned forward. "What is it?" Daniel opened the folder and spread out several documents. They were copies of emails exchanged between town officials and representatives from a mysterious organization called the Liberty Council. The messages revealed that the council had provided funding for drafting and promoting the ordinance, not just in Maplewood, but in dozens of other towns across the state. "The Liberty Council?" Karoline asked, frowning. "I've never heard of them." "That's because they operate under the radar," Daniel explained. "They claim to be a non-profit focused on promoting community values, but their real goal seems to be eroding civil liberties. Look at this." He pointed to a section of one email where the council praised the ordinance as a test case for future legislation. Karoline's heart sank. If the Liberty Council was using Maplewood as a testing ground, it meant the fight was bigger than she had imagined. "So what do we do now?" she asked quietly. "We take this to the media," Daniel replied. "If we can get national attention, it'll put pressure on local officials to back off. But first, we need someone who knows how to navigate the legal system, someone who can help us build a rock-solid case." Karoline nodded, though doubt lingered in her mind. Finding such a person wouldn't be easy, especially given her limited connections. She voiced her concern to Daniel, who simply smiled. "Leave that part to me," he said confidently. "I know just the person." A few days later, Daniel introduced Karoline to Emily Grant, a retired attorney who had once served as a clerk for the U.S. Supreme Court. Emily was in her late 60s, with silver hair tied neatly in a bun and sharp eyes that seemed to see right through people. Though initially skeptical of Karoline's involvement, Emily quickly warmed to her after hearing about the courtroom incident. "You argued constitutional violations in front of Judge Dawson without even being a lawyer?" Emily asked, raising an eyebrow. "That takes guts and brains." Karoline shrugged modestly. "I just spoke my mind. I didn't think it would go anywhere." "Well, it has," Emily said firmly. "And if you're serious about taking this all the way, you'll need more than guts. You'll need strategy, preparation, and a whole lot of patience." With Emily's guidance, Karoline began preparing for the next phase of their fight. They decided to file a federal lawsuit challenging the constitutionality of the ordinance. Emily helped Karoline draft the complaint, ensuring every argument was backed by solid legal precedent. They also gathered affidavits from other residents who had been fined under similar laws, adding weight to their case. As word of the lawsuit spread, Karoline received both support and backlash. Some people hailed her as a hero, while others accused her of stirring up trouble. Anonymous letters arrived in her mailbox, some praising her efforts and others threatening harm. One night, as she sorted through the mail, she found a note written in jagged handwriting. "Stop digging or else." Her hands trembled slightly, but she refused to let fear derail her. Daniel noticed the change in her demeanor and insisted on accompanying her whenever she left the house. "We don't know who's behind these threats," he said. "It's better to be safe than sorry." Despite the danger, Karoline remained resolute. She knew backing down would only embolden those who sought to silence dissent. During long conversations with Emily, she learned about landmark cases that had shaped American jurisprudence. Cases where ordinary citizens had stood up against oppressive laws and won. Their stories inspired her to keep pushing forward, no matter how daunting the odds. Meanwhile, Judge Dawson found himself increasingly conflicted. Public opinion was turning against him, with many accusing him of bias in fining Karoline. Even his colleagues questioned whether he had acted too hastily. To complicate matters further, Margaret Klein informed him that the Liberty Council had reached out to the courthouse, offering financial incentives to uphold the ordinance. "They want us to defend the law at all costs," Margaret said nervously. They're saying it's a matter of principle. Dawson clenched his jaw. Principle? This isn't about principles anymore. It's about control. Margaret hesitated. What are you going to do, Your Honor? He didn't answer immediately. Instead, he spent hours poring over case files, re-examining the arguments Karoline had made in court. Slowly, reluctantly, he began to see the flaws in the ordinance and in his own judgment. For the first time, he considered the possibility that he might have been wrong. Back at the library, Karoline continued working her usual shifts, trying to maintain a sense of normalcy. But whispers followed her everywhere she went. Patrons whispered about her bravery. Co-workers speculated about her chances of success. Even Lucy, who had always been supportive, couldn't hide her worry. "Are you sure you know what you're doing?" Lucy asked one afternoon as they restocked shelves. "This is starting to feel dangerous." "I'm not sure about anything," Karoline admitted, "but I can't turn away now. Too much is at stake." Lucy sighed. "Just promise me you'll be careful." "I will," Karoline assured her. "Besides, I'm not alone in this. Daniel and Emily have my back." Indeed, having allies made all the difference. With Emily's mentorship, Karoline grew more confident in her ability to argue complex legal points. She practiced delivering mock oral arguments in front of Daniel, who played the role of a skeptical judge. At first, she stumbled over technical terms and struggled to anticipate counter-arguments. But with each practice session, she improved, honing her skills until she sounded like a seasoned litigator. Finally, the day came when they submitted their lawsuit to federal court. As Karoline signed the final document, her hand shook slightly, but her resolve remained steady. This was it, the moment everything hinged on. Win or lose, she knew she had done everything in her power to fight for justice. News of the lawsuit sent shockwaves through Maplewood. Reporters descended on the town, eager to cover the unfolding drama. Local officials scrambled to defend the ordinance, issuing statements that contradicted each other. Meanwhile, the Liberty Council issued a press release denying any involvement. In the controversy, though, few believed their claims. Judge Dawson watched the chaos unfold from his chambers, feeling increasingly powerless. He had always prided himself on upholding the law impartially, but now he wondered if he had become part of the problem rather than the solution. Late one night, unable to sleep, he picked up the phone and dialed Margaret's number. "Margaret," he said when she answered, "pull the records from Miss Leavitt's case. I want to review them again." There was a pause on the other end. "Are you sure, Your Honor?" "Yes," Dawson replied firmly. "Something tells me we missed something important the first time around." As dawn broke over Maplewood, Karoline stepped outside her apartment and took a deep breath. The air smelled crisp and fresh, carrying the promise of change. She didn't know what the future held, but she was ready to face it head-on. Whatever happened next, she knew one thing for certain: she had already made a difference, and that was enough to keep her going. The ruling from the federal court sent ripples far beyond Maplewood. News outlets across the country picked up the story, praising Karoline Leavitt as a symbol of resilience and justice. Social media buzzed with hashtags like Freedom for All and "Thy Karoline Stands Strong." Messages of support poured in from strangers, parents thanking her for standing up for their children's right to express faith, activists inspired by her courage, and even lawyers who admired her legal acumen despite having no formal training. But for Karoline, the victory wasn't about fame or recognition. It was about the principles she had fought for, the idea that everyone deserved the freedom to live authentically, without fear of punishment for their beliefs. She spent the days following the decision quietly, reflecting on how much her life had changed. The shy librarian who once avoided attention now found herself at the center of a national conversation. One afternoon, as she sorted books at the library, Lucy approached her with a wide grin. "You're officially famous," she teased, holding up a magazine featuring Karoline on the cover. The headline read, "How One Woman Took Down an Unjust Law." Karoline laughed softly, shaking her head. "I don't feel famous. I just feel relieved." "Well, you should be proud," Lucy replied. You've done something incredible, and honestly, it's kind of inspiring. Though flattered, Karoline remained grounded. She knew the fight wasn't truly over. While the federal ruling invalidated the ordinance in Maplewood, similar laws still existed in other towns. Daniel reminded her of this during one of their regular meetings. "This is just the beginning," he said earnestly. "People are looking to you to lead the charge against these kinds of injustices." Karoline hesitated. Leading a broader movement felt overwhelming, especially after everything she'd been through. But deep down, she knew Daniel was right. If she stopped now, the momentum they had built might fade. Others needed her voice, her determination, and her example. With Emily's guidance, Karoline began drafting letters and op-eds to raise awareness about similar ordinances nationwide. She partnered with organizations dedicated to protecting civil liberties, offering her story as a rallying cry. Her arguments were sharp, her tone measured but passionate. Slowly, communities affected by such laws started reaching out, asking for advice and support. Karoline responded to each message personally, sharing resources and encouraging them to stand firm. Meanwhile, Judge Harold Dawson faced his own reckoning. Public opinion had shifted dramatically since the ruling, with many applauding his willingness to acknowledge his mistakes. His statement admitting fault and praising Karoline's efforts earned him respect among colleagues and citizens alike. Still, he couldn't shake the feeling that he had let people down. Not just Karoline, but everyone who trusted him to uphold justice impartially. Margaret noticed the change in him. "You're not the same person you were before this case," she observed one day as they reviewed upcoming cases. "It's like you've rediscovered your purpose." Dawson nodded thoughtfully. "Maybe I have. This whole experience reminded me why I became a judge in the first place, to serve the people, not my ego." He decided to use his position to advocate for greater transparency and fairness in local governance. He invited community members to attend town hall meetings where they could voice concerns about policies affecting their rights. Though some officials resisted his efforts, others joined him, recognizing the importance of rebuilding public trust. As weeks turned into months, Karoline settled into a new rhythm. She continued working at the library, finding comfort in its familiar routines. Yet she also embraced her role as an advocate, speaking at conferences and workshops about the power of ordinary people to effect change. Her talks resonated deeply with audiences, particularly young women who saw her as proof that anyone could make a difference if they were willing to try. Emily Grant watched with pride as Karoline grew more confident in her abilities. "You've got a gift," she told her one evening over tea. "Not just for law, but for inspiring others. Have you ever considered going to law school?" Karoline smiled faintly. "I've thought about it, but it feels like such a big step." "It is," Emily admitted. "But you've already proven you can handle anything they throw at you. If you want, I'll help you apply." The offer lingered in Karoline's mind long after their conversation ended. Could she really become a lawyer? The idea seemed daunting, yet exhilarating. For the first time, she allowed herself to imagine a future where she combined her love of justice with her newfound passion for advocacy. Daniel noticed the shift in her demeanor. "You're thinking about it, aren't you?" he asked one evening as they walked through the park. "Maybe," Karoline admitted. "It's scary, but also exciting. What if I could do more good as a lawyer than I can now?" "That's the spirit," Daniel said with a grin. "Besides, you'd crush it. Just think of all the cases you could take on." Her smile widened. "Don't get ahead of yourself. I haven't decided yet." But the seed had been planted. Over the next few weeks, Karoline began researching law schools and gathering application materials. Emily helped her draft essays while Daniel offered moral support. When she finally submitted her applications, she felt a mix of relief and anticipation. Whatever happened next, she knew she was ready to embrace it. In the meantime, life in Maplewood returned to normal, or as close to normal as possible. The controversy surrounding the ordinance faded from headlines, replaced by discussions about how to foster inclusivity and respect within the community. Town officials worked to repair relationships damaged by the divisive law, hosting events aimed at celebrating diversity. Even the Liberty Council retreated into obscurity, its influence waning as public scrutiny increased. Late one evening, as autumn leaves swirled outside her window, Karoline sat alone in her apartment, sipping tea and flipping through a worn copy of the Constitution. She paused on the First Amendment, tracing the words with her finger. Freedom of speech, freedom of religion, freedom to assemble, all ideas she had fought so hard to protect. A knock at the door interrupted her thoughts. Opening it, she found Daniel standing there with a bottle of wine and 2 glasses. "Thought you might need a break," he said cheerfully. "Care to join me?" Karoline laughed, stepping aside to let him in. "You always know how to cheer me up." They talked late into the night, reminiscing about the journey they'd shared and speculating about what the future held. As they clinked their glasses together in a toast, Karoline felt a profound sense of gratitude for her friends, for her supporters, and for the courage she never knew she had. When Daniel left, Karoline returned to her book, closing it gently before placing it back on the shelf. She gazed around her cozy apartment, feeling a quiet peace settle over her. The road ahead wouldn't always be easy, but she was no longer afraid of challenges. She had faced them before, and won. As she turned off the light and climbed into bed, Karoline whispered a silent thank you to whoever might be listening. For the first time in a long time, she fell asleep with hope in her heart and dreams of a brighter tomorrow. 2.